Hi everyone. Um, Today we're going to take a sort of different direction in the course from what we've been talking about thus far. Up until now, we've been sort of talking about issues and questions in terms of game design from a very theoretical perspective. So, what is a game? What is narrative? How do people play games? These kinds of questions, which are, of course, really important for us to think about uh, as we develop our design process and think about what kinds of games we want to make. But there's other more practical questions which are really important if you're planning on going into game design either as a career or as uh, an artistic practice. Questions like, how do I share my game online? How do I get people to see it? How do I get a job in the game industry? What is it like to work in the game industry? I've heard a lot of these questions from you, especially in our one-on-one meetings, and this week is when we're going to really tackle them. We're going to talk about three practical issues in game development: pitch, or how to find an audience and tell them about your game; scope, or how to manage your time while you develop games; and crunch, or uh, the issues that people often face in the game industry and how to think about those. So, first, we're going to talk about pitch. Now, what is a pitch? Essentially, imagine you're in an elevator with somebody and you need to describe your game to them before they get out of the elevator. In 10 seconds or less, you need to tell them what is unique about your game, what's interesting about your game, who might want to play your game, and why they should play your game as opposed to any other game. It should get people excited to play or to learn more or to look at a screenshot or a video. And it's something that you're going to be using over and over again if you present your game at a convention, if conventions happen again, which I imagine they will, uh, at some kind of showcase, many of which are digital these days. Play tests are a really important place to pitch your game. You have to tell playtesters quickly about what your game is and what your goals are. And also in online marketing. So a lot of the time on Twitter, you'll get like hashtags that ask you to uh, pitch your game to people. And if you're advertising your game on websites like Itch, you need to draw people in a single sentence. These are going to be really important marketing tools for you if you get into independent game development. And pitching your game is a really, really important skill, maybe the sort of core skill to being able to market your game and to find an audience for it. And so there's four sort of types of keywords that people tend to use in their game pitches. There's the play style or the number of players. So you might describe your game as cooperative, team-based, online, free-for-all, single player, you know, sort of whatever, right? Essentially, this describes the kind of social experience that players are going to have with your game. Then there's your core mechanic. So we've talked about core mechanics a lot already, so you can, I'm sure, imagine a few words you could use here, but things like divination or deck building, strategy, tabletop, puzzle, whatever you think is sort of most interesting and unique, especially if you have multiple core mechanics, that's the one you should think about using here. An adjective that describes your game experience: fast-paced, relaxing, short, real-time, turn-based. Aside from the sort of social component of how many people do I need to play this game with, or when should I schedule playing this game with my family or friends or on my own or whatever, the adjective describes the kind of experience that you want players to have or that you think players will have. And this will draw different kinds of people to your game. And lastly, a description of what you do in the game. So this could be a description of your narrative. This could be a description of your of a core theme or a central idea that you want to explore, I put some kind of descriptions of games from my own portfolio. Uh, so you play as birds fighting krakens, or you build a world in under an hour. These are really snappy descriptions. They're like essentially about 6 to 7 words at most, describing what characters do in the game in a way that draws people in and makes them want to know more. So here's a fun game, and this is going to be part of your exercise this week if you choose to do it. Pitch ad libs. So this is like a really basic template for a kind of pitch that you could give to people. Game name is a either adjective, playstyle, or core mechanic game in which you do something. There's a really simple sentence. You'll see this exact sentence construction like all over the place in game design. But to give you an example, I'll go back to a couple of the games that are on my portfolio. Bilgebirds is a turn-based naval strategy game in which you play 7 spunky birds defending their archipelago from a host of krakens. So, turn-based strategy game immediately draws in a particular audience of people who are more experienced with games, who are interested in sort of like difficult, meaty strategy. But then the birds theme, in conversation with the naval theme, it makes the game feel sort of kooky at the same time. So there's a sort of element of like very experienced players, but this also isn't like a war game where people are dying and there's, like real drama. This is a game about like cute birds versus angry krakens. It's very cartoonish. So immediately you get a sense of the kind of experience you're going to have, the kind of aesthetic the game uses, and also something that's unique and interesting about it that might make people want to play more. Here's another example. 1 Hour World Builders is a cooperative card game for 4 players in which you collaboratively build a world in under an hour. So, there are surprisingly few cooperative card games for 4 players, and this makes 1 Hour World Builders immediately unique. The concept of building a world sounds like really grandiose and exciting, so it draws players in immediately. What does it mean to build a world? How do you collaboratively build a world? And also, why build it in under an hour? Like, we think of world building as a really long-term activity, something that's going to take you days or weeks or whatever. So again, there's something unique about the game that it describes. It tells you like how many players are going to be involved, and how those people are going to be playing together, the kind of social experience they're going to have, in just a single sentence. So I recommend, even aside from the exercises this week, that you take one of the games that you've produced for the course so far and try and play pitch ad libs with it. So just off the top of your head, think about what's unique or interesting about it and sort of slot it into this, and you can make a pitch really easily. Now, here's some sort of additional tips and tricks about finding an audience, and this is maybe one of the hardest aspects of game design. I know a lot of people personally who are game developers who work really hard on these games that are really interesting, and then they don't find an audience for them. And so, they have like 5 likes on the tweets that they send out about their game design. This happens to a lot of people, especially people who struggle with marketing for social media, which is like really unfortunate, right? But I think one way to think about this beyond sort of being able to tweet consistently and game the algorithm is to think about finding a group of people who's going to be really committed to enjoying and playing your games. And I think the first thing you have to accept for this to happen is that not everybody is going to like your game. I think a lot of us imagine making games that are going to change the world, that, millions of people are going to play. and talk about, and this isn't the reality for most of us, and that's actually okay. It's totally fine for not everybody to like your game. And in fact, thinking about a specific group of people instead of thinking about the broadest audience possible can actually make your game more interesting in the end. So within that, you have to think about whether you want a really niche audience. So some people make games that are specifically targeted towards fans of a specific genre, and uh, it's really hard to play those games unless you are really familiar with the genre, but also you can get a really dedicated, interested audience. Or do you want a more broad audience where you want to bring people together and have people play games across play your game across demographics? Uh, Again, the question of genre comes up. Do you want a more established genre to work with, where people are going to be comparing your game to the popular games in that area? Or do you want to break new ground and potentially not have as dedicated an audience, but also have a lot more artistic freedom? Of course, think about games that you'd like to play. We all want to design games that are fun for us at some level, but at the same time, try to imagine an audience who's not you. So try to think a little bit beyond yourself. So one thing that I think can be really helpful is articulating who will and won't like your game. And it can be sort of freeing to say to yourself that there's certain groups of people who just aren't going to like your game. That's totally fine. And here are a few different sort of ways to do it. You can talk about the type of experience that you want players to have. Again, we talked about this before. I've been talking about it throughout the semester. But you might say that you want your game to be creative or intimate or funny or competitive. These experiences aren't going to be what everybody's looking for. But the people who are looking for them, if you can tell them exactly what kind of experience you want them to have with your game, you might draw more people in. You can talk about the genre, and when I say genre in games, this is a little bit of a difficult term because sometimes people mean the story. So for example, there's science fiction games, fantasy games, Western games, but people also talk about design genres. So, turn-based RPGs are a genre of game, or a farming simulator is a genre of game. And regardless of what you mean when you talk about genre, you can find different audiences in that way. So there are people who play science fiction games across all kinds of design genres or gameplay genres. And then at the same time, there's people who will play your game regardless of what the story is, as long as it's like a bullet hell game or a fighting game or something. Difficulty, accessibility, depth. So some people really enjoy playing games that are really hard. Other people would prefer to play a game that's more relaxing and open to people who don't have fine motor skills that are great. So you can specifically talk about that, whether your game is friendly for families or good for children or friendly to beginners. And representation. Especially nowadays, and certainly in Toronto, there's a growing community of like marginalized indie developers. So people who are making games and specifically thinking about their role not just as game designers, but as game designers who are queer, or game designers who are racialized, or, for example, specifically indigenous game designers or Asian game designers. There's all kinds of ways that you can think about your relationship as your sort of different lived experiences, and how those relate to your games that you're developing. But if the games that you're developing speak to different experiences that you have in different ways, then you can also find an audience this way. So if you have a game that talks about your experience as a queer person, then you might be able to find an audience of other queer people who have similar experiences. These are all different ways to articulate what kind of an audience you're looking for, and what kind of people might be excited about your game. So let's take a quick look at itch.io. Now, Itch is a website that is quite popular for showcasing independent games and putting them online. It's sort of an alternative to Steam, if anybody's familiar with Steam. And if you look on the front page, Itch showcases different games each day. Some of them are games that people made from game jams, or they're demos, they're unfinished. A lot of these games are made by one person or a couple of people. Itch is a really good place to start developing a portfolio of game design, and it's also a really good place to look at examples of game pitches that people have made and the way that people market their games. So let's take a look at a few examples. So the first one I wanted to look at is this game called Mechanical Star Astra, and these aren't, I'm actually not familiar with these games. I just clicked on them from the front page of Itch so that we could sort of get like very real examples. So, you know, let's for a second put aside the really intense graphics and like really juicy gameplay and look at the section that reads about this game. It says, Mechanical Star Astra is a colorful, stylish, high-energy bullet hell shoot-'em-up. It mixes a solid arcade foundation with more modern elements to deliver a full package filled with a large variety of content that many kinds of action game players can enjoy. So we can see immediately, just from that first couple of sentences, exactly what kind of audience they're looking for. It describes the genre. It's a bullet hell shoot 'em up. Bullet hell games are games where you usually pilot a ship and the screen fills with enemies and bullets, and if you touch them, then you die. So you have to sort of dodge them while hitting back. It uses a few really good adjectives: colorful, stylish, high energy. So you can already tell this game is going to be really intense to play. It's probably not going to be for beginners to the genre, but also it is purporting to be more aesthetically interesting than a lot of other bullet hell games that can be kind of dark. And it also is clearly working within an established genre. So it says that it mixes a solid arcade foundation. This means that they're really excited about a few bullet hell games that were made in the 80s and 90s. So they want people who have been fans of this genre for a long time, but they're innovating on the genre by adding more modern elements to deliver a full package. Overall, it's a really, really strong pitch here. You immediately get a sense of the kind of audience and everything, even without the sort of exciting gifts that they're also using here. You can even name your own price, so you can get it for free if you want. Here's another game that's maybe a little less sort of mainstream or targeted towards experienced game players. This is called Terra Nil. The first sentence reads, Terra Nil is a reverse city builder about ecosystem reconstruction. So immediately, again, there's some stuff here about the specific genre, a reverse city builder. And I think a lot of people are going to say, well, what's a reverse city builder? I know what a city builder is, sort of. You know, if you've played SimCity or if you've played Cities Skylines, any kind of game that involves building a city, this is a very sort of old genre that does have a lot of fans, both sort of casual fans who played SimCity as a kid on their parents' computer and more experienced like game players who are really into the genre. But a reverse city builder immediately makes you ask, well, what's that? What do they mean? And then about ecosystem reconstruction. So immediately you get a sense of this thematic idea of the game and sort of what they're trying to do. And what they're trying to do is make a city building game that makes you question the role of cities in like climate change and eco collapse and stuff. So again, they're articulating the kind of audience they're looking for through their sort of thematic interests. If you're interested in sort of political games or games that are going to make you think more deeply about your life, then Terra Nil is the game for you, especially if you like these sort of city building simulations. And finally, let's take a look at Extreme Meat Punks Forever, bound by Ash. Now, this is a sequel that was just released to the original game, Extreme Meat Punks Forever. And in some ways, it's a little messier than the others. But the first sentence reads, Extreme Meat Punks Forever is a serial visual novel mech brawler about gay disasters, beating up neo-Nazis, and giant robots made of meat. So you can see here there's sort of less discussion of the mechanics and more discussion of the plot. So you can already tell that it's a more plot-focused game and that it has a really immediate political bent. It's gay disasters, beating up neo-Nazis. So, you know, immediately it's targeted towards, like, a left-leaning audience, let's be honest, right? Like, definitely people who, yeah. And also specifically a queer audience. They talk about gay disasters, you know. Queer disasters is, like, a pretty common term in certain queer spaces, so, this is a big part of it. And then it says in giant robots made of meat, and it's like, what? In addition to the kind of overt political messaging of the game, you also get this like weird turn where the robots are made of meat, and the game suddenly becomes sort of surreal also. So each of these games uses a slightly different strategy to find an audience, but they all have really effective pitches that tell us something about the game, make us understand how the game is unique and different from other games before it, and get us excited to play, especially if we're part of a demographic that it's appealing to. Let's move on to scope. Now, we're sort of moving backwards in time here. Pitch and audience are for when you're in the later stages of your development process and you've already kind of finished making your game and you sort of know specifically what it is. But how do you manage the game development process in and of itself? Here's a few keywords, and these are words that you're gonna see in sort of game design circles everywhere from independent development to the industry. Minimum viable product, MVP. This is the simplest version of your game that would give you useful information if you released it. So for some people, this would be like a very early stage alpha, which just means like a very buggy version of your game that only has some of the features in it. For some people, this would be called a vertical slice, which is where you get a little taste, sort of like imagine a slice of a cake, you get a little taste of sort of every central mechanic of your game, but the content hasn't all been added. And for some people, this would be like a very sort of plot minimal version of your game, where maybe it tells a single story out of a bunch of stories that you wanted to tell. Stretch goals are components that you would like to have, but are not required to release your game. They're sort of nice to haves, but not necessary. And then a game design document is a large document. You can find templates for this online, and honestly, I use those templates too. That describes your broad game design goals, concepts, and mechanics. And when you're working with a team, game design documents are used so that everybody is sort of on the same page about what they want to make. So you don't realize 2 months into development that one person is imagining like a 3D game and everybody else is imagining a 2D game, for example. So these are all terms that you're going to see a lot as you get into game development more and more. And there are also ways to articulate the scope of your game. So often people talk about a minimum viable product in the context of a release timeline. So you might say, I have a year to work on my game, and within this year, what can I produce? That's the minimum viable product. Game design document is used to make sure that you have a sort of checklist of things that you can do. And stretch goals are ways to talk about things that you'd like to do without overburdening yourself with features that you don't really need. So here's a few do's and don'ts when it comes to scoping. Do break your game down into specific manageable chunks. This means taking a look at your whole game and thinking about every sort of specific aspect that it's going to involve. So you might say, you know, if you're doing the art on a game, you might break it down into all of the spriting for characters, all of the sort of drawing of objects, and then the drawing of menus, and maybe a font or something, backgrounds. These are sort of specific chunks, and then from there you can break it down into like, how many backgrounds do I need? How many objects do I need? Can I reuse objects for different situations or color swap them? What about characters? How many character sprites do I need? Prioritize your tasks. So this is really, really important. A lot of game developers get into a problem where they prioritize things that they're excited to do, even if those things aren't as necessary to do immediately. And so they end up putting off tasks that are actually more important to do. So prioritize the things that are most important, and the sort of stretch goals and nice to haves, put them off till later. Factor playtests and revisions into your timeline. I've noticed a lot of people, especially with the social play assignments so far, who did not factor in playtests into their timeline. So they imagined, okay, the assignment's due on this date, I'm gonna get together with my group a week before it's due. That doesn't work, because organizing playtests with people, finding people to playtest your game, this kind of stuff takes quite a while, and making revisions and making changes to your game is going to take even longer. And do prototype. The first assignment was sort of a way to introduce you to the concept of prototyping, and it's very, very useful, especially as you start making digital games. Making physical prototypes can give you a sort of sense of the kinds of mechanics that you want to make, and give you a roadmap for what you want to do in the future. If you don't prototype, sometimes the final product game that you make can be really boring, and because you didn't test out the mechanics, you don't realize that until you're too far in the development to make any changes. So that's some do's. Here's some don'ts. Don't generalize your tasks. So if you make a checkbox that says do all the art, that checkbox is going to be staring empty at you for like months. And it's going to make you feel awful the longer that it stays empty. So when I say manageable chunks, I mean things that you can do within like a day or a couple of hours, so that you're always feeling like you're checking stuff off and you always have a sense of how far you are in the process. Don't jump in without organizing. I think it can be really tempting for us to immediately start sort of programming little prototypes or making art or making sounds or writing a whole story, but if you don't have the sort of roadmap of what you want to do, then that can quickly end with you having a lot of stuff that you're not going to use in your game and a lot of wasted time. Don't get attached to a specific vision of your game. Sometimes as developers, we think that our ideas are really good when they might not be. And so we go into playtests and we don't want to hear that our game is actually not that interesting to our playtesters. So this is why learning to playtest and to ask for feedback is really important, because you have to learn to listen to people, and when you get a bad playtest, you have to learn to make revisions and do better, make a better game instead of doubling down on the sort of idea that you have, that you're wedded to. And don't add features midway through development. This is another term that I didn't put in the list. It's called feature creep, and maybe some of you have heard of it. You're developing your game and you think it's going to look one way, and you have a pretty nice schedule that you're keeping to really nicely. And then you're drawing some stuff, and while you're drawing this stuff, you think, oh, it would be so cool to have a procedurally generated main character. Or, it would be really interesting to have a complicated dialogue system. Or maybe I could make 200 cards and make a whole deck for my players to play with, or an interchangeable board, or something like this. And these features can add weeks or months to your development time, but they seem exciting to you, and so you want to move forward with them, and you end up adding weeks, and then you think of another feature and you add more weeks, and then you add some more months, and you end up never finishing your game because you're always putting more tasks in front of you, right? This is a real big trap that a lot of game designers fall into. In fact, I would argue it might be one of the biggest problems. And in the context of this class, what's going to end up happening is you're going to hand in something that's half finished because you couldn't finish any of the stuff that you wanted to do. So make a plan for your design schedule and stick to it, and allow for change from your playtesters, but don't let yourself get carried away coming up with new ideas and expansions of your idea. And now we're going to talk about crunch. And this is probably something that a lot of you haven't thought about. I know that when I was your age and even a little older, I dreamed about career in the game industry. I thought it would be really exciting to work on the kinds of games that made me feel certain ways and were really formative for me as I was growing up. And so because you're excited and passionate about the game industry, you may come up against articles like this and decide to ignore them. These are headlines that I found this spring from the game industry. There are many more that are more recent. These kinds of articles come out all the time. Video games are destroying the people who make them. Every game you like is built on the backs of workers. Video game creators are burned out and desperate for change. As Naughty Dog crunches on The Last of Us 2, developers wonder how much longer this approach can last. The game industry is a really difficult place to work. There are many companies that make the games that many of you enjoy as your favorites, that work their employees 80 to 100 hours a week regularly. It's not uncommon in the game industry to hire a bunch of developers who are young and excited at the beginning of a development cycle, have them work on a single game, working these kinds of awful hours that can make you literally physically sick, and then lay them all off once the game ships and reaches its audience. Overwork is a real problem, and it leads to people burning out of the industry often within 5 years. I know a lot of people who have burned out and have dealt with lasting mental health issues and even physical issues from this industry culture. It's not something that you should take lightly. And I hear from a lot of people who are young that, well, I am actually really excited about the industry, and maybe if I'm excited and I'm willing to put in that time, why shouldn't I be allowed to? And the reason is because nobody should have to put in this amount of work. This is even if you think that you can put in that amount of work, chances are you can't. And even if you can, it means that other people near you, your friends, and specifically often people who have other financial obligations, people who have families, like partners and children, who end up suffering the most. So if you're looking at a job in the industry, I think the first thing you should do is go in with consciousness and clarity about what it's like working in the industry. And that means talking to people who have been there, and that definitely means reading these kinds of articles and accounts. So how do we deal with this beyond just awareness, right? If you look at this and you decide, I can improve it from the inside, I'd rather try, and I don't want to give up on something that I'm passionate about, which is absolutely understandable. I think that despite the burnout, people are proud of the gains they make, and that's understandable and fine. So I want to give you some tools to maybe prevent this kind of issue. So learning how to scope your game individually is going to help you see issues with scoping in the workplace. So the first thing is to scope. You can easily, even as an independent developer, you can actually burn yourself out on your own games because you work really, really hard and spend all of your time working on something for weeks and weeks. And when it's not finished at the end of that, you feel exhausted with it and maybe give up on it. So this is why I advise young developers always to start small. Not every game you make is going to be your magnum opus. Not everything you make is going to be a sort of life-changing, huge, incredible work. And so being willing to make games that are imperfect and small, but that exist in the world, even if they're only played by a few people, I think this is a really important skill to learn as a developer. And it'll help you not burn out on projects because you'll finish them before you have the chance to. When you're collaborating with people, check in on them. Make sure that they're not working 10 or 12 or 14 hours a day on your project. Make sure they're taking breaks. Make sure that you start early enough, especially when it comes to classwork, that you are able to take your time thinking about a game instead of scrambling and crunching on it at the end. Of course, I put don't work in the game industry here. My personal advice right now, given the state of the game industry, is that I wouldn't want to work there. I think I've had opportunities to work in the game industry, and I've refused them because I think that it's a place that is very difficult to work, and even if you make it to a high enough position that you can work without overworking yourself, that's all predicated on making other people work really hard. So if you're interested in working in the game industry, I think you should really organize for better working conditions. Game Workers Unite is a really great resource to think about here. There's been a big push recently for unionization in the industry, and I really hope that by the time you all graduate that things are really different. But
yes, well, I mean, the creepers were a mistake. I defined.
I think that even just being a voice within your workplace for compassion and understanding and trust that people want to get things done, and recognition that people have personal lives and health issues that are going to be a higher priority than finishing and shipping your game on time, I think these are really important ways to make the game industry better. So I know it's a really sort of sad thing to end on, that I, your game design instructor, think that it would be dangerous for you to work in the game industry. But I think it's a dereliction of duty for me, to not tell you about the reality of what it's like. And the reality is that it's not good. So that doesn't mean that we should abandon game design. I think game design is even more important given how bad the industry is, because it means that outside the industry there's opportunities to make really innovative, interesting games and to rethink what our labor processes can look like. But I think it's a really important thing to think about, and as you get older and think about what kind of a career and what kind of a life you want, thinking about a place that's going to prioritize your health and well-being as a person is really, really important. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'll talk to you next week. Sorry, it's been a little long, but I'll talk to you soon.